We now continue with our Prince Takamado Japan Center Distinguished Speaker Lecture. The PTJC seeks to provide opportunities for interdisciplinary study and research that promote Japan studies, strengthen research that situates Japan in global, transnational, and comparative contexts, and connect expertise in these areas in Canada. Now, these aims and the many fields in which we pursue them, language, business, culture, politics, history, technology, science, others, they might seem distinct. One might wonder, for example, how can a poem, play, or popular print created hundreds of years ago in Japan speak to us now as we strive to meet the challenges of our digital age, or a few decades from now when AI is something different? Well, if anyone can point us in the direction of some answers to these questions, it's the distinguished speaker whom I'm thrilled to introduce to you now, Dr. Joshua Mostow. He is professor of pre-modern Japanese literature and art at the University of British Columbia and one of Canada's most eminent scholars of Japanese culture. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and in April of this year, the Japanese government awarded him the Order of the Rising Sun, gold rays with neck ribbon, for his contribution to the development of Japanese studies and promotion of mutual understanding with Japan. Professor Mostow's lecture is titled Applied and Pure Research in Japanese Studies.
Thank you, Ambassador Yamanouchi, colleagues, guests. I'm honored to have been asked to address you today on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Prince Takamado Japan Center for Teaching and Research. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the territory of the Nehio, Nesitepe, Meti, Nakoda, Dene, Hodenoshone, and Anishinabe lands that are now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. The University of British Columbia, where I teach, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, while I myself live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Both the University of Alberta and of British Columbia respect the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit nations. And I'm, again, honored to be asked to address you on these territories today. To be frank, one of the reasons I agreed to speak to you today was because of a dissatisfaction I have felt for some time about the lack of acknowledgement given to the majority of research done in the humanities by the universities that I am familiar with. I believe my own UBC Faculty of Arts is representative. Every month, they send out an electronic Arts Insights newsletter consisting of typically 4 to 5 news stories highlighting research being conducted in the faculty. Here is the August 2024 newsletter with its art stories from across UBC section. While this might look very diverse in topic, please note that the faculty members highlighted are in the departments of psychology, sociology, political science, and journalism. All except the last, social sciences rather than the humanities, and all without exception presentist in focus, concerned only with the immediate here and now. Apparently nothing is happening in our understanding of history in any culture or language. The arts media link that you see is even more discouraging. Here, academic units listed are the Center for Migration Studies, the Department of Anthropology has an article about people joy running in Angkor Wat. Geography has 2 articles about migrant workers, 10 articles from political science, 5 from psychology, 5 from the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, then 2 from the School of Economics, 2 from sociology, and 1 from journalism, writing, and media. There is 1 from the School of Music. The only article related to the humanities is 1 from the Department of Philosophy on self-help advice on, quote, how to be more spontaneous as a busy adult, unquote, and 1 from the Department of Asian Studies on the fall of power of Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. So This accounts for a total of 12 of the over 30 departments, schools, institutes, and cultural venues that comprise the Faculty of Arts at UBC. One wonders what's happening in the other 18 units. Most of these are, of course, the things that are talked about, important topics, speaking to many of the pressing and critical problems of the contemporary world. Yet these topics must account for a very small percentage of those being explored by the majority of researchers in the Faculty of Arts. What is being done in ancient Mediterranean Near Eastern studies? Art history, French, Hispanic, and Italian, English language and literatures? Is there nothing of importance or relevance or even interest happening there? The reason for this imbalance on this page is that the newsletter is simply collecting references that have been made to UBC scholars in media throughout the world. Well, this is collecting the low-hanging fruit. And universities need to be more proactive in communicating to the public the importance of the range of scholarship being pursued by their faculty, a topic to which I will return at the end of my remarks. A fascinating collection of essays has recently been published, Women in Japanese Studies, Memoirs of a Trailblazing Generation. It comprises reminiscences of 31 women who were part of the post-World War II boom in Japanese studies in North America, starting with the late art historian Ellen Conant, who arrived in Kyoto on a U.S. Fulbright grant in 1953, to literary scholar Esperanza Ramirez Christensen, who took up a Mombusho, or Ministry of Education scholarship, in Tokyo in 1968. Their stories are truly inspirational despite, or perhaps because of, the honesty of their account, which includes often blatant sexism. Historian Marion Mayo reports that in the early 1960s, quote, at a job interview at the Association for Asian Studies conference, the interviewer from Indiana University walked out when he saw I was a woman, unquote. And they're graciously passing references to instances of sexual harassment. These are important history lessons that I plan to have all my PhD students read. But all that is another talk, and one that I am not qualified to give. Instead, I would like to focus on a distinction made in the reminiscences by my good friend, the historian and professor emerita of Sophia University, Tokyo, Kate Nakai, author of Shogunal Politics, Arai Hakuseki and the Premises of Tokugawa Rule, and many other works. In her essay, she writes, quote, we advise students to come up with a well-defined topic for a paper or thesis, and concern for a particular issue undoubtedly drives many research agendas. However, my long-evolving relationship with Hakuseki brought a recognition that important as it is to arrive eventually at a problem around which to structure one's findings, a more productive initial step may be to explore a source and see where it leads, unquote. It seems to me that the difference that Nakai is pointing to here is in some ways analogous to the distinction in the sciences between pure and applied research. We are fortunate indeed that there are scientists involved in looking for cures for various cancers, but they cannot do their work unless other scientists have explored cell structure and related foundational knowledge. And we do come across articles in those monthly university newsletters about the discovery of, say, the essential role of RNA, ribonucleic acid, often thought of as the poor relation of DNA, in the creation of proteins. But very rarely are we informed of the new discoveries in the field of, for example, Slavic philology. What I would like to suggest is that the study of texts, in their largest sense, not only writings, but other human products, such as visual culture and embodies rituals, the study of text is essential for the progress of knowledge. But what does progress of knowledge actually mean, and in the humanities? To me, it is the constant expansion of the repertories of human activity and social structuring. It is the ability, based on linguistic and historical knowledge, to defamiliarize what we take as common sense and see that over the history of millennia, human beings have approached life and any of a number of problems and issues in very different ways than we do today, thus allowing us the possibility to think outside the box. In this regard, and in terms of Western Anglo-European culture, Japan has for hundreds of years been exemplary. Since the first Jesuit priests reached the archipelago in the 1500s, Japanese culture has consistently confronted the West with a different way of seeing things, a different way of doing things. On the one hand, some of these ways have sometimes horrified Western observers, certain sexual practices in the 16th century, though they could have gone to Venice and seen much the same thing. On the other hand, they've also been taken as models, such as the promotion of patriotism and devotion to the emperor that some English observers found so laudatory when encountering Meiji Japan in the wake of the Boer War, a conflict called by some Britain's own version of the United States-Vietnam War. So a model of regeneration of national character. The approach I am highlighting does not start from a contemporary problem that needs solving, but rather it starts with a text, perhaps even one that has been forgotten. Again, an analogy might be the exploration and cataloging of flora and fauna in some remote region of the globe. It might be that one of the plants or animals discovered will become invaluable in some medical breakthrough. But before that can happen, they have to be discovered and analyzed without regard to their immediate usefulness. This approach has had a deep effect on my own scholarly career. As some of you may know, one of my areas of research over the years has been the Hyakunin Isshu, or the 100 Poets, One Poem Each collection, an anthology traditionally attributed to the great poet and scholar Fujiwara no Teika from the 13th century. The work is a collection of waka, or what is today called tanka, five-line poems of 31 syllables by 100 different poets dating from the 7th to the 13th centuries. But my particular area of study is what is called reception history. As the Czech scholar F.X. Shalda wrote, quote, "Literary history very wrongly limits itself to describing only the genesis of a work, by which is meant its creation from its first impulses and initiatives up to its material embodiment. A second and often greater and more difficult part of the task awaits it, to describe how the work has changed in the minds of those following generations who have dealt with it, who have lived on it, fed on it, and nourished themselves on it. This is the second part of the biography of a work, and it is frequently, even usually, neglected," unquote. My focus has been on the reception of the 100 Poets in the Edo period, the early 1600s up to the Meiji Restoration of 1868. This was a time when the knowledge of the 100 Poets expanded from being the sole possession of the aristocracy, elite warriors, and privileged clerics, to something that all levels of society were familiar with, the foundation of what I would call popular literary literacy. Now, my first foray into this field resulted in my 1996 volume, Pictures of the Heart, the Hyakunin Isshu in Word and Image. Here I gave a translation of each poem according not to how the original, let's say, 8th century poet might have intended it, but how the anthologizer Teika would have understood it in the 13th century. These are 3 pages of the first poem. I then gave an overview of the interpretive debates that had followed each poem, starting with the earliest extant commentary from the beginning of the 15th century. Finally, I compared these interpretations to illustrations of the poems created in the Edo period. You see 2 of them on the far right there. I should point out that in terms of the commentary tradition, which is hundreds of years long, I relied on compendia made by Japanese scholars. The texts that these scholars focus on, however, are almost exclusively aristocratic, contained in unique handwritten manuscripts based on oral teachings conveyed from master to usually individual students. Yet the explosion of printing and publishing industry in 17th century Japan changed all this, and many of the formerly secret texts were made available to the buying public. Separately, a popular genre of illustrated commentaries arose. Professor Yoshikai Naoto has complained that there is virtually no research being done on these Edo period books with commentaries and illustrations. He opined that the reason for this was probably due to their popular character and their cheapness. He also noted, however, that the printed commentaries were far more widely distributed than the manuscripts to which scholars had devoted their almost exclusive attention. Likewise, Tanaka Sosaku, in his study of the pre-modern commentaries, emphasizes the importance of illustrated editions with commentaries in the spread of the classics to a wider population. It is from such texts that I took the illustrations for Pictures of the Heart. Yet, as you can see, these publications, these books of illustrations and commentary, also had a written commentary, which you can see there on the far left. The fact of the matter is, however, that in the early 1990s, when I wrote this book, I could not read the commentary. Not because it was in Japanese, not because it was in classical Japanese, but because it was written like that. It is written in script different from what is used today, called hentai gana, variant style kana, and using cursive Chinese characters, or kazushiji. Training and being able to read such text was virtually unheard of in North America at the time I was a graduate student. Years later, having achieved some proficiency in reading Edo period texts, and rather than taking texts and illustrations from a number of editions as I had in my first book, I decided that I wanted to reproduce and translate just one specific edition to show how Edo period readers understood the 100 poets. I settled on an edition that appears to have been widely printed and reprinted. Indeed, an edition was even reissued in the Meiji period. So this is going over quite a period of time. My base text was a very late and very inexpensive edition called Keigyoku Hyakunishu, or the Auspicious Jewels 100 Poets, described on the title page as illustrations and commentary in the upper register, Tousho Uta no Etoki. The first copy of this work that I encountered was not in a prestigious library, but rather in a boroichi, or junk fair, at Togo Shrine in Tokyo in 2006, and I purchased it for 3,000 yen, which was probably about 20 bucks. This edition was published by Shorindo in Edo and is listed in the Daikokusho Somokuroku Union catalog as having been produced in the Ansei era, so that'd be 1854 to 59. The Keigyoku edition is in smaller chuban format, 17 by 11 centimeters, and clearly marked for a female audience, being listed in the publisher's catalog in the back, with other female-oriented texts such as the Onna Daigaku, or Greater Learning for Women, and Onna Te Kun Orai, or Women's Garden of Textbook Instruction. In such texts, there was in principle a sparse use of Chinese characters. And when there were Chinese characters, they always had ruby or furigana on them. And you can see that here. That's how to read that character, but even up here, and more importantly up here, it's not unusual to have the readings on the poems itself. This is the chirashigaki that was introduced to you earlier today, the scattered writing. Here you have the readings for all the kanji, all the Chinese characters, and that would not happen if the texts were printed for males. Interestingly enough, despite this kind of rule, the Chinese ideographs in Keigyoku, the text I'm using, the commentary, are not glossed. And in fact, the Keigyoku uses significantly more Chinese characters than a related earlier edition. Actually, so this is Empress Jito's poem. The text above is from an earlier edition, and you can see characters in yellow on the second one are Chinese characters that have replaced Japanese kana writings in the Keigyoku edition. From the very beginning of publishing the 100 Poets, there was a rupture, a zure, between the courtly commentary tradition and popular understanding. We can see this in the earliest Chuiri Eiribon, or edition with both written commentary and pictorialization of the poem's meaning, in the 100 Poets of them. This is by Moronobu, you've seen it already. For each poet, there is an imaginary portrait, kasene, a genealogy of the poet, the poem scribed in scattered writing, or chirashigaki, and then a written commentary based on that of the Yusai commentary, Hosokawa Yusai, and finally, a picture of the kokoro, or heart, of meaning of the poem. Now, in the written commentary to this poem by Emperor Tenji, the first poem in the collection, the Hosokawa's commentary here said the emperor is taken to be the speaker of the verse by Emperor Tenji, and it's in his voice, expressing his compassion for his farming subjects. There are also secret meanings that this is a lament on the part of the emperor on the decline of Odo, the imperial way, and also includes mourning for his deceased mother, Empress Saimei. More basically, there seems to have been two schools of thought concerning the phrase kariho no io, which you see there at the bottom left. I hope it's visible. Kariho in the poem is a contraction of kari-io, or temporary hut. Kariho no io then is what's called kasane kotoba, word duplication, the hut, the temporary hut. However, some commentators saw it as a pivot word, a kake kotoba, a kind of pun, meaning kari-ho, cut ears of rice. Now, Yusai, in the written commentary, rejects the cut ears, the reaped ears, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And yet, as you can see, the illustrator Moronobu, in addition to the mandatory hut, here has precisely the peasants cutting ears of grain. So, despite the fact the written commentary is saying it doesn't mean this, the illustrator has said, oh, yes, it does. Okay, so there's this kind of gap. The most significant development in the exegetical tradition of the 100 poets in the 18th century, this is 17th, had without a doubt been the rise of what's called national learning, or kokugaku, and its philological method. No longer were interpretations from teachers simply accepted on the basis of aristocratic pedigree. The meaning of each word was now arrived at deductively through comparisons with other contemporaneous texts. While this method first appeared in regard to Japanese literature with Keichu, the vehemence of these scholars' rejections of those traditional interpretations is most striking in a text called the Uimanabi, or First Lessons of 1765 by Kamo no Mabuchi. In reference to the poem by Emperor Tenji, Mabuchi insists that the poem is not by Emperor Tenji, nor even from his time period, but is a corruption of a poem from the 9th century, that the speaker of the poem is a peasant, not an emperor, and that the poem is neither a lament about the imperial way, nor a song of mourning for his imperial mother. Mabuchi's explanation is precisely how the poem is interpreted by scholars today. It is not clear, however, how quickly these new, more scientific interpretations filtered down to the popular level of readers in the Edo period. In fact, there was a distinct vernacular or popular interpretive tradition, what Japanese scholars call zokkai, though that usually they just mean one particular interpretation, not a whole tradition. This line of popular interpretation can be traced back to another edition produced by Moronobu, the Furyu Sugate Hyakunishu, or Elegant Full Figures, Pictures of the 100 Poets, published the year after his death in 1695. This is what I would call a mitate, where in the main image, taking up about 2/3 of the page, the poem is enacted by contemporary figures, that is, people from 17th century Japan. The upper register of the page is divided in half, one part given over to the inscription of the verse, and the other to a brief commentary. The visual interpretation of all the poems, almost all the poems, is erotic, often humorous, while the commentaries are again based, for the most part, on the Yusai commentary, though they include interpretations found nowhere earlier, and perhaps were also meant to be taken parodically or humorously. For example, in Poem 2, the name of Mount Kagu is connected with heavenly beings hanging their robes there to dry. The text up there says, this Mukashi kono yamae. In the past, heavenly maidens came down to the mountain and hung, that's kakeru, kaku, their robes to dry, which is why it is sung of as Mount Kaku. This interpretation is found nowhere else. This is unique. The Keigyoku is part of this vernacular commentary line of transmission. As indicated here, you can see the robe floating. Here you can see Tenjin Kudasari Te. The heavenly beings are coming down and the angels are hanging their clothes. So same line of commentary, getting its commentary from Moronobu's 1695 work. In the Keigyoku edition, what we see is what Edo commoners literally made of the 100 poets, what they wanted it to mean regardless of any scholarly pronouncement. Emperor Tenji's poem is an authentic verse by him and is about his royal concern for the hardships endured by the peasants. Empress Jito's poem is about the seasonal change of clothing, which is how it was usually interpreted, and refers to the myth of heavenly maidens descending on Mount Kagu. Now, it seems to me that in this context, we are moving away from literature per se and towards folklore, defined not by orality, but by what the anthropological folklorist Alan Dundas calls multiple existence and variation. As Dundas explains, quote, "The concept of folk as employed by folklorists in Europe normally refers either to the lower stratum of society or to an old-fashioned backward segment within so-called civilized society," unquote. The folk of folklore exists only once you have modernity and literate societies. Dundas is writing 50 years ago at a time when, according to him, the idea of urban folklore seemed like a contradiction in terms, whereas, of course, we believe it exists very much so. In 1975, Dundas challenged these views, so almost 50 years, publishing a collection of what he insisted was folklore, focused on mechanically reproduced American humor often found in business offices. You're going to have to think back a little bit to get an idea of what that is, but I'll show you. His key criteria for an item of folklore was that it, quote, "exists in multiple versions and in more than one time or place. Such items are typically anonymous and not limited to oral transmission, such as graffiti, especially what is politely called latrinalia, so graffiti in washrooms. Most interesting for my purposes, however, is that he explicitly contrasts folklore to literature. Quote, "A poem written by a poet or a song written by a composer is not a folk poem or a folk song unless and until it exists in at least two or more places or forms. Whereas the text of a literary poem is presumably the same each time one reads it, the text of a folk song is never exactly the same. Each version of a folk song is just a little bit different from any other version," unquote. Surprisingly, the data that Dundas presents in the study have all been translated through photocopying. Quote, "Whereas one might think that an individual might be content merely to copy a cartoon via Xerox and leave it at that, it is clear that individuals take time and trouble to redraw traditional cartoons. Yet the versions are similar enough to show genetic interrelationships. The materials contained in this study, as Dundas's, are traditional. They manifest multiple existence in space and time, and they exist in various forms." And the clearest vision of this is this. We can see the transmission of the cartoon, the style and skill of the figures varies, as does the exact phrasing, but the same message is conveyed. So suddenly we can have folkloric variation even within mechanical reproduction, which is the key here. Something very similar happens in the Keigyoku and other popular texts. The Keigyoku exists in two editions made from different blocks. Edo printing is done on wooden blocks, single block. You ink it and rub it, and you get a few hundred copies. And then it's worn down. And you want to make more. What do? Well, you take one of the copies, you take the page, you paste it upside down on another block of wood, and you recarve it. That's called kabusebori. Depending on the skill of the carver, you have an exact reproduction. That would be the easiest thing, if not perhaps the cheapest. Here, what has clearly happened is someone has rewritten it. That is kana, nari, to be. That is kanji, nari, to be. That's where the changes come, and those changes always come into bringing more kanji in. This is kind of like our Xerox example. In other words, they could have just recarved it and had the same thing, but they've actually gone to the trouble of rewriting it. This is not unique. We have variation here. You can see the upper version is better made, better drawn, and the lower version is kind of a quick, cheap knockoff. Finally, as for the literary poem that is always the same, right? So the argument is, yeah, but a Shakespearean sonnet is always that sonnet, and it doesn't change. If someone says, I'm going to recite it, they don't do a variation on it like a folk song. But if we look at Mibu no Tatami, I won't go into the details here, but suffice it to say, due to a misunderstanding about the poem's original grammar and a disagreement among later commentaries about whether the final syllable of the poem should be voiced as ga or as ka, our editor has taken the exceptional step of actually changing the wording of the poem so that the final syllable is not ka or ga, but ni, which makes the meaning of the poem unambiguous. Again, and this version of the poem is found in no other edition. In a townsman's family in the Edo period, there could be several iterations of the 100 Poets. There might be a calligraphy copybook made for one or more of the children in the house by the priest of the local temple who was known for his handwriting. In fact, these large representations were meant to be copied out by hand to learn handwriting. And handwriting for girls is actually how they learned literacy. There weren't separate readers, yomihon or tokuhon. They learned by copying calligraphy. So there might have been a copybook made by the local priest. There might be a set of utagaruta, poem cards. These might have been created by a parent or a grandparent, fully handmade, or consisting of black and white woodblock prints that had been hand-colored. Manuscript culture survived in tandem with commercial printing, and changes and errors could enter any handwritten text or handwritten copy of a printed text. The family might own one or more printed commentaries, one giving the latest kokugaku interpretation and another the more popular understanding, or one for the daughter and another for her more learned father. A neighborhood dignitary might give regular lectures on the 100 Poets based on a printed commentary. We have evidence for this. And then there were parodies and multicolored prints, nishikie, which I'm not even getting near today. Through these and poem card recitation and the not always perfect memorization of the 100 Poets, the poems circulated orally as well as in print. Commentaries might share many interpretations, but phrase them differently, like the retelling of an anecdote or joke. All this, it seems to me, comes close to the definition of folklore as characterized by multiple existence and variation. The 100 Poets was not just a literary text, but something that belonged to the folk and blurs the lines between what we might confidently differentiate as high literature, folklore, and commercial popular culture. But of course, none of this knowledge is accessible without the ability to read the text. In other words, without understanding the Japanese language and the writing system. The Prince Takamado Center has, for the last 20 years, been one of the strongest supporters of Japanese language education in Canada. For almost a quarter of a century, it has promoted and supported the study of Japanese language and cultural exchange. It has organized the Alberta District Speech Contest and supported the national contest, awarding the Prince Takamado Grand Prize. It led the Japan-Canada Academics Consortium and continues to participate in the Kakehashi program. It supports a summer program with Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, as well as many other activities. Of course, between applications like Google Translate at ChatGPT, which we heard about just a moment ago, there are those who suggest that language training will soon be a thing of the past. And indeed, such tools are becoming increasingly accurate and helpful. And related tools are beginning to unlock massive amounts of knowledge in Japanese that have been available to all but very specialized scholars like myself. I'm speaking here about a great deal of work that was published in the modern Edo period that you have been seeing here. These works, written by hand, and sheets of such writing that were then carved into woodblock printed books, cannot be read by most Japanese. This is not simply a matter of handwriting, which is now a problem even for historical documents in Europe because students are not taught cursive writing. As I said, a different syllabary. As late as the Taisho period, so up to 1926, the Japanese language was written in a script far more variable than its contemporary descendant, what I have said is called hentai gana, where every sound or phoneme of the Japanese language could be represented not in just what we know today as hiragana, katakana, and romaji, which is already 3 for every sound, but as many as 16. I'm showing you here the hentai gana from Ihara Saikaku's 1686 Koushoku Gonnin Onna, or 5 Women Who Love Love. There are, for ka, 16 different kanji that the kana can be based on. And here's what it looks like when it all goes together. Unless and until such texts are described into modern Japanese orthography, they are, in a very real sense, prevented from being treated as knowledge. This is true not just of fiction or literature, but also historical documents. However, fairly recently, optical character recognition, or OCR, programs have been developed that can transform these texts to a certain degree of accuracy. Here is what happens with the app Mio on my iPhone to that page of Saikaku you just saw, where the kana have been replaced. Using a similar program, the research group for historical earthquakes of Kyoto University has created Minna de Honkoku, a cooperative platform where amateur history buffs help transcribe selected historical documents. According to this website, to date, they have over 5,000 participants and have already transcribed 6 million characters. When we think about such apps and programs, we usually immediately think of machine translation, or MT. Quote, a family branch that once ruled over the utopian dreams invested in AI, but long since dethroned, crashing down in the 1960s, unquote, to quote University of Chicago professor Hoyt Long. Contemporary research now view MT, and I quote again, as an inherently hybrid technology. When MT becomes good enough in a particular translation setting, where good enough might mean good enough to be post-edited or good enough to convey the gist of a source text, then the potential partnerships between human and machine start to proliferate. Not just, oh, I'll just throw this into a machine and boom, it'll come out perfectly. That it requires a hybrid of human and machine. Indeed, I think we are witnessing a convergence of technology and traditional humanistic inquiry. This has to do not only with how things are studied, but the very what of study. Today, in an Asian Studies department, a PhD student is as likely to write a dissertation on Japanese video games. This is by Murakami Haruki. Ben Whaley is a professor at the University of Calgary. On early modern board games, Suguroku, based on the extremely popular 19th century picaresque novel Tokaido Chu Hizakurige, or Shank's Mare Along the Eastern Sea Highway, as the original novel itself. Or Laura Moretti of the University of Cambridge is studying Edo period graphic narratives, kanazoshi, that ask to be played rather than read. And a recent PhD student at UBC has used game theory, based every bit as much on video games as chess, to explicate Heian period utawase, or poetry contests. The Prince Takamado Center and the University of Alberta have, I think, positioned themselves well, helping, for example, to establish Replaying Japan, an annual international conference on Japanese game culture led by Jeff Rockwell, who was here but had to go teach the ethics class in the computing department, so someone's still worried about that, and partnering with Ritsumeikan and recently SUNY Buffalo. The conference is also noteworthy for its, quote, intentional effort to share industry insights in an academic context, unquote. It is now one of the 3 conferences where student research is recognized through the Princess Takamado Essay Contest. Many scholars throughout Canada and North America are embracing digital humanities in its multifarious guises, including computational criticism. Clearly, almost all humanities researchers will soon need to know how to write code. This is why I'm retiring. It seems to me that the Takamado Center may be just the place to promote this development. Now, I used the expression popular literary literacy today and argued that some texts from what we might call high culture literature can be transformed into folklore. Yet I am not ignorant of the fact that the term cultural literacy was first coined by University of Virginia professor E.D. Hirsch and wielded as something of a weapon by mid-brow populist xenophobes in America's culture wars of the late 20th century, a conflict that now, quite frankly, seems never-ending and has infected Canada as well. Indeed, the very concept of folklore itself begs the question of who is the folk. These are not questions to which the STEM disciplines are going to provide answers. This is also obviously true of decolonization and indigenous rights, redress, and resurgence, as well as racism and sexism more generally. What the humanities provides is, on one hand, scholars engaged on the ground with these very issues, applying critical theory and linguistic knowledge in public engagement. But what I have tried to stress today is the other hand is also important. The scholars who provide deep historical context for the places we have been and the paths that have been forgotten. Without the fresh air that the knowledge of the past can provide, we risk, as the philosopher George Santayana suggested over 100 years ago, simply repeating the errors of the past. As we move towards an ever more integrated world and the necessary adjustment away from the Eurocentrism that has defined our thinking and our disciplines, I believe a study and knowledge of Japan will continue to be of critical importance. It is my hope that in the next quarter century of the Prince Takemoto Center for Japanese Teaching and Research, that the center will support not only programs that address urgent challenges through seed funding and fora, but also senior and emerging scholars, preservation and study of analog culture without a set agenda or preconceived outcomes, as well as contributing to the dissemination of that research through the support of public-facing humanities research. I believe that it is only with both pure and applied research that we will achieve the true realization of our potential in the future. And I thank you.
I was wondering in what other ways that are considered typical of folklore the reception of poets took place. For instance, popular religion, were they worshipped, were they celebrated?
You know, a student of mine recently asked me that question, a keener, and I obviously interested in pre-modern religion, and heard of my 100 Poets lecture and said, you know, is there a connect? I don't know of one. There's probably some form of bibliomancy that uses either volumes or karuta, but I'm not sure, and I don't think it's been written about much.
I work with script handwritten texts, more Chinese than Japanese, but I also work with some by Japanese writers. I'm not a practitioner of calligraphy myself. It is extremely time-consuming and challenging to read the cursive script, even for Chinese, much less hentai kana, which you showed us. Nobody taught that to me when I was in school. People just said, oh, you have to practice calligraphy to be able to do it. So my question is, how did you learn to read hentai kana? Did you write it? What relation does this bear to the women, ostensibly women, who were learning to read by tracing and drawing?
So in early modern Japan, boys' education, girls' education was very different. Boys were learning Chinese, which meant, you know, no one's copying out Confucian classics. They're learning to read it, and of course they have to do it in Kanbun Kundoku, which means they're jumping all over the place. But anyway, the point is, first you memorize it, and then after you've memorized the text, then they start explaining it to you. So that's one learning system. Really interesting to think, how does that affect male and female minds? You know, there's a completely different way of learning between, and for girls it was copying this. I got told too, oh yeah, go find a calligraphy teacher and that's how you're going to learn hentai kana. You know, I don't think that's true. I learned it by teaching it, and the way I did that was every summer I had to teach an intensive seminar at a Japanese university. Students were all Japanese, and I realized that if I just gave them more and more secondary material, I was the one that was going to get swamped, not them. So I decided I had to even the table somehow, and started using handwritten text, printed text. They couldn't read them. I could read them. Well, with the 100 Poets, first of all, you can get obviously, Katsuji, a printed typeset, top modern edition, and you can go find Emperor Tenji's poem, and you can kind of figure it out, and then you give them lists of the jibo. Anyway, so it was just by using printed text ad that came close to what I was trying to make it work. I should say that, I mean, just like young people in the West can't read cursive handwriting anymore, trying to teach Japanese students hentai kana can be very painful because if you have a continuous line, they don't know which part of that line carries meaning and which is just carry through from the other character. And you say, no, this section, ignore this section, no, ignore that, it's this here. It's a steep learning curve. So if you have to teach a shuchu kogi, I recommend there's a method.
While listening to your lecture, I remember my high school days, the content.
Okinodoku-sama.
And it was so hard for me to grasp the meaning itself. Professor, you were sort of reading from that original treaty. So for most of the Japanese people couldn't read it. If they know the character, they can get the grasp of the big meaning. How did you start to study that kind of original paintings?
Well, because I'm interested in reception. It's very curious that the majority of Japanese scholars, when they want to say, how was the 100 Poets read? Well, let's find a commentary. Oh, here's a commentary by Prince so-and-so. Well, how many people read Prince so-and-so's commentary? And on top of that, how do we know it really is Prince so-and-so's commentary? These are manuscripts of, quite frankly, dubious authenticity. I don't know if you've heard, but it is now being generally accepted that the Hyakuni issue itself is a forgery. You know, getting away from all that authenticity stuff and kuden and hiden, and just seeing how it was explained to common people, I think is an interesting exercise, because that represents a greater understanding, a greater percentage of the understanding than a specialist. And that explains how even today you can have a manga based on, you know, karuta, or a live action, or all this kind of popular culture that still keeps it alive. And you're not going to get that by reading Hosokawa Yusai's commentary. Yeah, I can guarantee you. And
This is kind of a follow-up to the last question. How do we know how widespread popular texts were? We've got booksellers, catalogs, I assume.
Yeah.
The low price will tell us that they were pretty affordable.
sure, that of course is a big question. There are those Zohan Mokuroku publishers' catalogs in the back of the books that they're selling. I could show you a slide, I don't have it with me here, that shows one publisher with 30 different editions of the 100 poets. So that tells you if one publisher is making that many different publications thinking they're getting a different price point or a different something, then it has to have been pretty popular. We don't have sales figures. We don't have numbers of print runs, and that's true for almost any early modern book. My method, which is not universally accepted, is that if you can find it cheap in a Boroichi, there must have been a fair number. If you can find several copies of it, you know, inexpensively, still in the 21st century, then they probably printed a lot of them. You can find copies of the Aikoku Hyakuni issue, which was a propaganda thing done during the Second World War, and they are pristine. No one read them. You can find boxes of the karuta. No one used them. So even though you can find them, that doesn't mean they were popular. But these works, as I hope you could see, have been used. It's kind of touching to see how a family would try to repair one of these little booklets rather than just recycling, because recycling of paper was a very common thing in the Edo period, and yet somehow it still seemed valuable to repair and try to keep in a rather shabby condition. So that's the kind of level of engagement that I'm trying to explore.